Welcome to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Kahn. Thank you for listening as always. This is part 9 of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, entitled Guardian Angel. On the previous episode of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, we covered events from mid-July 1789 to early October of the same year. A period of less than 5 months, but a highly eventful one to be sure. To briefly recap, we picked up the narrative with the run-up to the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, the event that is most often cited as the true beginning of the French Revolution. Even before the long-awaited Estates General convened on May 5th in Versailles, public order had been breaking down in the city of Paris, just 10 miles or so to the northeast. It was in the city where the effects of the nationwide economic crisis were most directly felt, with food shortages being the most significant cause of the people's immiseration. The citizens of Paris paid close attention to developments coming from Versailles, and as the Estates General grew more and more contentious, unrest in Paris grew accordingly. Tensions had reached a boiling point as of July 12th, when news reached the city that King Louis XVI had dismissed Jacques Necker from his office as Minister of Finance. Necker was seen by the masses as a champion of the common people, and his dismissal, along with the mustering of some 25,000 soldiers outside the city, could only be interpreted by the people as evidence that the king was intent on reasserting his authority. Rumors abounded that the cause of the ongoing economic distress was a counter-revolutionary plot to starve Paris into submission, and so the citizens of Paris, urged on by passionate orations and fiery publications by radical agitators, took up arms to defend themselves from the imminent royalist crackdown. As Paris descended into chaos, the deputies of the National Assembly, still based in Versailles, pleaded with the king to withdraw his troops, but to no avail. Fearing that the authorities would move against them next, the National Assembly chose to hold an emergency session the night of July 13th. The Marquis de Lafayette, elected as vice president of the Assembly, led the session through the following day. That evening, momentous news arrived from Paris. A mob, several hundred strong, had stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress-turned-prison that had long stood as a symbol of royal despotism. They had overwhelmed the prison's garrison and summarily executed its governor. The next morning, the king appeared before the National Assembly to plead for their assistance in quelling the disturbances in Paris. In exchange, the king legitimized the heretofore illegal National Assembly and promised to cooperate with them in creating a constitution for the kingdom. Lafayette, accompanied by the president of the National Assembly, the astronomer-turned-politician Jean-Sylvain Bailly, rode to Paris to deliver this news to the people. Once there, they were met by a group of 120 electors of the Third Estate, who had organized themselves into an emergency municipal government for the city known as the Paris Commune. Bailly read the king's concession speech to the electors, after which they unanimously proclaimed him to be the mayor of the city, with Lafayette as the commander-general of the National Guard. This was a new militia force that was established to defend the city of Paris against potential aggression from the royal army and to maintain public order internally. With this second mission, Lafayette initially had quite a difficult time of it. The situation in Paris remained tense in the days immediately following the storming of the Bastille. The slow withdrawal of the royalist forces gave the people cause to second-guess the king's true intentions. On July 17th, the king decided to visit Paris as a demonstration of good faith, against the wishes of his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette. Entrusting his personal safety to Lafayette and the National Guard he now commanded, a visibly shaken King Louis processed solemnly into the city and to the Hôtel de Ville, the headquarters of the municipal government. There, Louis was offered a blue, white, and red cockade, and affixed it to his hat, a gesture that appeared to confirm his acceptance of the revolution and its ideals. Lafayette hoped that the disorder in Paris would subside after the king's visit, but before the week was out, he would see firsthand that this was not to be the case. On July 22nd, a mob seized a royal official who was widely blamed for the persistent food shortages in the city. They dragged him to the Hôtel de Ville and were fully intent on killing him. Lafayette pleaded with the mob to show restraint and to wait for the official to be brought to trial, but his words had no effect. The mob dragged the man outside and, after having failed to hang him from a lamppost, simply tore him apart with their bare hands. A short time later, they subjected another captured royal official to the same fate. All the while, Lafayette could do nothing but look on helplessly. The next day he tried to resign his post, as it was clear that he no longer had the confidence of the people. The electors of Paris would not accept his resignation, and begged him to retain his position, which he eventually agreed to do. Inspired by the show of devotion that his abortive retirement provoked, Lafayette threw himself into his duties as commander of the National Guard of Paris with renewed vigor. His first priority was to organize the National Guard, which had heretofore been a chaotic mess, into a disciplined and reliable armed force. To this end, he created a command structure, standardized the uniforms and equipment, established a corps of professional soldiers, and expelled from the ranks those without the means to furnish their own supplies. As far as restoring the peace was concerned, Lafayette recognized that it was necessary to do more than just go around the city dispersing riots. He and the National Guard sought to ameliorate the people's economic distress, primarily by ensuring that the city was adequately supplied with grain and other foodstuffs, or at least trying their best to. As I've said previously, the nature of Lafayette's mandate, that is, the simultaneous preservation of liberty and the restoration of order, forced him to maintain a difficult balancing act. But between July and October 1789, he pulled it off rather well. Historian Simon Schama writes the following analysis of his actions in this period. Quote, "He managed, overall, to offset the obviously unpopular aspects of his police actions with occasions guaranteed to enhance his personal popularity, especially when given full coverage by his friend Jacques-Pierre Brissot in his paper La Patriote Française. In one such affecting scene, Lafayette visited houses in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, where some conquerors of the Bastille, wounded on the 14th of July, were languishing without food or adequate medical attention. In all these activities, and without deliberate design on dictatorship, he was clearly moving into the space vacated by royal authority. For at least a few months, Lafayette became the father-provider of the city, its judge and arbitrator, the source of police protection and military authority." End quote. Tempers in Paris did gradually cool off as July turned to August, and the National Assembly, hoping to halt the spread of revolutionary upheaval into the countryside and across the kingdom, went about doing away with the legal basis of the feudal order. Over the course of one overnight session on August 4th, they abolished the right of the nobility to collect dues from their subjects, the sale of government offices, and noble exemption from taxation, among a whole host of other seigneurial rights and privileges. These acts, referred to collectively as the August Decrees, were submitted to the king for his approval, along with a finalized draft of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen that had initially been proposed by Lafayette prior to July 14th. However, despite being hailed in the National Assembly as the, quote, restorer of French liberty, end quote, in private, King Louis XVI seethed with resentment. Encouraged by the people around him, most notably the Queen, he resolved to stand his ground against what he saw as attempts to usurp his divinely sanctioned authority. He deliberately refused to promulgate either the decrees or the declaration until certain demands of his were met. This standoff with the National Assembly dragged on for weeks, all the while economic conditions in Paris only continued to deteriorate. Another poor harvest that year led to more acute shortages of food. Supplies dwindled and prices skyrocketed. More and more people waited in long lines for bread that was simply not there. Acts of violence naturally ensued. Throughout September and into the first days of October, bands of hungry citizens attacked baker shops and supply carts with greater frequency, and threatened to enact vigilante justice on people they suspected of hoarding food. The starvation plot conspiracy theory from that summer re-emerged in the newspapers and pamphlets being issued from the Palais Royal. Blaming the king, or more precisely the cadre of corrupt ministers that surrounded him, for the near-famine conditions in Paris, calls went out for the people to march on Versailles. Lafayette and the National Guard were doing their utmost to stem the tide, but they were dangerously close to being overwhelmed. The existence of a counter-revolutionary plot against the masses was all but confirmed on October 4th, when the papers reported of a lavish banquet held in the Opera House at Versailles, in which the king's bodyguard tore off their tricolor cockades and trampled on them. A grave and deliberate insult to the nation that the Queen herself allegedly approved of. I'd like to make a couple quick points of clarification before we move on. Since the 16th century, there had been a branch of the French military that was directly accountable to the royal household and not the Ministry of War. Units belonging to this branch included the Swiss Guards, an elite company of Swiss mercenaries, the French Guards Regiment, which was formally disbanded by the King on July 15th and its entire strength subsequently incorporated into the National Guard, the Black Musketeers, a ceremonial regiment consisting of the adolescent sons of nobles, and the Garde du Corps, literally translating as bodyguards, who were organized into 4 companies, at least one of which would be stationed at Versailles any given time during the year. In the past, these and other units belonging to this branch of the French military did see active service during wartime, but in more recent years their duties had been limited to mostly protecting the sovereign and their family. As such, by the reign of Louis XVI, most of the units assigned to the royal household had been relegated to a ceremonial role. For instance, the Black Musketeers, which only continued to exist as a sort of sinecure for young noblemen. As you may recall, Lafayette himself had served as a Black Musketeer in his youth, and seems to have gained no practical experience from it. The bodyguards were a similar case, as a candidate's pedigree and their manners at court were considered a far more important thing than any martial aptitude. They rarely, if ever, underwent any sort of actual military training, were poorly disciplined, and were entirely useless in an actual combat scenario. In fact, there were relatively few troops under the command of the royal household that were an exception to this trend, the Swiss Guards and French Guards among them. The king's decision to disband the latter had left him with significantly fewer soldiers in his vicinity that he could rely on to defend him in the event of an uprising. This explains why he felt the need to call the now infamous Flanders Regiment to Versailles in early October. Apologies for that lengthy digression, but some of that information will be relevant later on in this episode. To return to the narrative, tempers in Paris had reached a boiling point by the morning of October 5th, 1789. The tumultuous events of the next 2 days would begin in the marketplaces of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, a predominantly working-class district on the eastern edge of the city, also, not coincidentally, the site of the Bastille. The population of the area had risen dramatically in recent months, thanks to the influx of peasant migrants who had come in a futile search for employment. For this reason, the district was hit particularly hard by starvation. That morning, when the women of the district went to the marketplace to purchase bread, they were told for the umpteenth day in a row that there was no bread to be purchased. These women were referred to by their usually aristocratic detractors as poissards, which literally translates to fishwives. This term originally referred specifically to women who sold fish in the marketplace, but over time, the poissard became a kind of stock character, a stereotype of lower-class women, as vulgar, ill-mannered, unsophisticated, immoral, and temperamental. This stereotype has long since lost its relevance, but it has continued to influence writing on the French Revolution to this day, even if contemporary authors are explicitly aware of it or not. I think it is thanks in part to this stereotype that there is a common misconception that the decision of the market women to march on Versailles that morning was spontaneous, a spur-of-the-moment reaction to the announcement that there was no bread. But it must be remembered that writers like Jean-Paul Marat and Georges Danton have been calling for such a demonstration since September. A few of the more politically active poissards had been planning for this for some time, waiting for an opportune moment. That morning, with reports of the orgy of the guard, as Chama refers to it, still fresh in everyone's minds, the announcement that there was no bread at the market was just what they needed to urge the masses into taking immediate and drastic action. Led by a woman steadily beating a marching drum, hundreds of market women arming themselves with pitchforks, butcher's knives, makeshift pikes, and whatever other instruments were close at hand, marched toward the Hôtel de Ville. They compelled churches along their route to ring their bells, which prompted others to follow suit, and it was not long before the unmistakable warning sound of imminent danger could be heard across the city. Hundreds more women, in turn, poured out onto the streets to join the demonstration, and by the time they converged on the Hôtel de Ville, they numbered between 6,000 and 10,000 depending on the source. They demanded that Lafayette and or Bailly address their demand for bread, but it was not yet even 9 a.m., and neither of them were there. Only a skeleton crew of National Guard stood between the mob and the Hôtel de Ville, but the militiamen refused to fire on the crowd. The women simply pushed them aside and entered the building, requisitioning for themselves some 700 firearms and 2 cannons. They may well have caused more significant property damage had it not been for the intervention of one Stanislas Maillard, a man whose reputation as being the first revolutionary to make it into the Bastille gave him credibility with the masses. He saved the Hôtel de Ville's quartermaster from being strung up on a lamppost, and redirected the mob, or at least a good portion of them, toward Versailles. As they marched, they shouted that they were going to go see their good father Louis. Here, Chama remarks, quote, "It was in the nature of the poissards that the line between affection and deadly abuse was never made exactly clear." End quote. It took Lafayette nearly 2 hours to reach the Hôtel de Ville on account of the tumult in the streets. He found thousands of civilians still occupying the public square in front of the building. By that time, most of the women had set off toward the palace, while those who stayed behind had been joined by quite a few men, their husbands, brothers, sons, and so on. Lafayette quickly learned that his troops refused to act against the will of the demonstrators. In fact, they, for the most part, sympathized with their cause, and a growing number of them wanted to march on Versailles themselves. As Lafayette later wrote, the men of the National Guard were every bit as indignant as everyone else about the events of the banquet on October 2nd. They demanded that their general lead them to Versailles in order to, quote, wipe out the royal bodyguard and the Flanders regiment that trampled on the national cockade, end quote. The prevailing sentiment seems to have been that the bodyguard and the Flanders regiment were corrupting influences on the king, and that the National Guard should take over their duties instead. According to Lafayette's account, one of his men, a lieutenant identified only by his surname, Mercier, spoke on behalf of the rest of the guard. Quote, "My general, we must go to Versailles. All the people want us to. The king has fooled us all, you and everyone else. He must be deposed." "His son will be king, you will be regent, and all will be well." End quote. Lafayette rejected the idea of himself being regent out of hand. As we discussed toward the end of the last episode, Lafayette was very averse to any suggestion that he take more power for himself, despite being constantly entreated to do so. Nor did he think it was desirable to depose Louis XVI. He tried to dissuade the guards from this course of action by reminding them of the oath of loyalty to the king that they'd all sworn not so long ago, but this proved unconvincing. Lafayette spent the next several hours meeting with the municipal councils in the Hôtel de Ville to discuss how they might defuse the situation, while periodically stepping outside in the vain hope of reining in his troops. Writing some 6 decades later, the historian Alphonse de Lamartine described Lafayette's dilemma in the following terms. Quote, "These hours were like centuries for him, and his sole choice was between mistakes and misfortunes." End quote. Lafayette continued to resist the entreaties of his men to join the march on Versailles until the late afternoon, about 4 or 5 p.m. By then, a cold autumn rain had begun to fall, and the crowd was becoming restless. Chants of "To Versailles" could now be heard emanating from the ranks of the Guard. It was at that point that Lafayette reached the conclusion that the National Guard was determined to march on Versailles with or without him. An outright mutiny would be the likely result if he continued to refuse his men, which would not only undo all the progress that he had made over the last few months to organize the National Guard, but in all likelihood would end up with him being strung up from a lamppost as well. Ultimately, Lafayette's personal safety was a secondary consideration to him. He realized that only by his presence could he maintain some semblance of order among the ranks, and ensure that the march did not end in a mutually destructive bloodbath for both the royal household and the National Guard. And so, feeling he had no choice in the matter, Lafayette finally relented. To save face, he asked the Commune to issue him written orders to go to Versailles to prevent disorder, which he was granted. After dispatching a messenger to ride ahead of him, to give advance notice to the government and to the National Assembly, Lafayette stepped out into the pouring rain, mounted his horse, and, facing down his men, at last gave the order. 15,000 National Guard began the 12-mile trek to Versailles, followed closely by roughly as many civilians. Lafayette reluctantly took his place at the head of this massive column. As he did so, he could hear someone cry out, quote, "It is not for Lafayette to lead the people, but it is for the people to lead him." End quote. After about 3 hours, they reached the Pont de Sèvres, a bridge over the Seine River at the far southwestern edge of Paris. He ordered the column to halt for a moment. Lafayette was apprehensive. He'd received no word from Versailles all day, and as such he had no clear idea of the situation he was about to lead his men into. But once again he felt the matter was out of his hands. In his journal, Governor Maurice recorded, quote, "Lafayette has marched by compulsion, guarded by his troops who suspect and threaten him. Dreadful situation, really. Obliged to do something that he abhors or suffer an ignominious death, with the certainty that the sacrifice of his life will do nothing to prevent the mischief." End quote. Seeing that the road ahead was clear at least, Lafayette gave the order to cross the bridge. Alluding to Julius Caesar's storied march on Rome in 49 BCE, Lafayette wrote that this moment was his own crossing of the Rubicon. In fact, by that time, the first contingent of demonstrators who had left that morning had already reached Versailles. The march had taken them about 6 hours, and at the end of it, the women were disheveled, fatigued, drenched from the rain, and both hungrier and more agitated than they were to begin with. They were welcomed by a detachment of the National Guard assigned to Versailles, who plied them with wine and brandy. Hearing the commotion outside, some deputies from the National Assembly, which was in session at that moment, went out to investigate. Among them was Jean-Joseph Mounier, a deputy from Grenoble, who had become the Assembly's president after Bailly. Mounier admitted my lord, the group's unofficial spokesperson, into the meeting chamber to lay out their grievances before the Assembly. My lord's statement indicated that the protesters' demands were, at this point, still limited in scope. Quote, "We have come to Versailles to demand bread, and to request the punishment of the royal bodyguards who have insulted the patriotic cockade." End quote. Hardly had my lord started speaking when hundreds of women, now drunk on the refreshments the guard had so kindly offered them, barged into the chamber. They made quite the commotion, haranguing the more conservative deputies when they attempted to plead for calm. Others, like Mirabeau and Maximilien Robespierre, who was still a relatively obscure figure, received them more favorably. Mounier tried to reassure the women that the king was doing all that he could, but they would not accept this explanation unless they heard it from Louis himself. When the first reports of the march on Versailles reached them that afternoon, Marie Antoinette was, according to her lady-in-waiting, Madame Campan, listlessly passing time in the gardens while Louis was out hunting. At the first sign of trouble, the king raced back to the palace with his entourage, while the queen began making preparations to evacuate. However, these preparations could not be made quickly enough, and the mob was approaching fast. The Flanders regiment mustered into formation in front of the palace and prepared to stand their ground, while the Swiss Guard took up positions in the inner courtyard. Louis had caught a glimpse of the mob as he returned, and perhaps realizing that their only hope was to de-escalate, he had the Flanders regiment withdraw behind the gates to the palace grounds, under strict orders to not fire on the women. Temporarily convinced that the women meant him no harm, Louis called off the evacuation. He was given cause to reconsider this decision when a group of them tried to force their way through the gates, only to be met with the rifle butts of the royal bodyguard. But by then, as Madame Campan put it, quote, "the moment to flee was lost." End quote. Louis agreed to meet with a small delegation of protesters. Mounier escorted 6 women nominated by their compatriots to the king's apartments for an audience. Among them was 17-year-old Pierrette Chabry, who was selected to speak to His Majesty on account of her refined manners. Upon entering his presence, she immediately fainted. Louis, uncharacteristically charming, brought her smelling salts, helped her to her feet, and kissed her hand, a display that did much to diminish the mob's fury in that moment. The king sent them on their way, with reassurances that he would have all the bread in the palace distributed to the people, and that the palace bakeries would work through the night to produce more for them. These promises were enough to placate some, and my lord led a relatively small group of them on a triumphant procession back to Paris. Most of the crowd, however, was not satisfied. They were convinced that Chabry and the others had been deceived. They were used to empty promises from the crown, and were certain that the king would go back on his word. Though this demand had not yet been clearly articulated, it is quite possible that by this time, the protesters had added an additional objective to their demonstration, to bring the king and his family back to Paris with them. The common people had long felt that it was impossible for the king to properly conceive of his subjects' plight from his ivory tower in Versailles. This was an argument that even the most fervent reactionary would be hard-pressed to dispute. The reason why Louis XIV had relocated the monarch's residence to Versailles in the first place had been to remove himself from the caprices of the Parisians. In this new post-absolutist age, this arrangement was no longer seen as appropriate. Many people had yet to reject the idea of a monarchy entirely, but if the king was truly to become a king of the people, it was necessary for him to leave his bubble of opulence and reside among his subjects. Only then, so the thinking went, could he be trusted to uphold his promises. Around 6 o'clock that evening, the rider who Lafayette had sent ahead reached Versailles, bearing the news that 15,000 National Guard had just set out from Paris. The king did not know what to do. Louis knew that such a large force could easily overwhelm his bodyguard, take the palace by storm, and overthrow him. Moreover, Louis was distrustful of Lafayette, and he was not convinced by his reassurances that he was only intending to protect him and his family and to prevent further disorder. After consulting briefly with his advisors, Louis agreed to accept both the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the August Decrees without qualification. This was obviously a desperate move, taken at the last moment in the hopes of compelling everyone to stand down and go home. But Lafayette and the guard continued their march, and the mob of women at the gates did not disperse. It was well after nightfall when Lafayette and the National Guard, now marching by torchlight, reached Versailles. Their trip had taken them significantly longer than the initial contingent of protesters, thanks to the steady rain that had reduced the roads to a muddy slog. Lafayette halted the procession and compelled his men to renew their oath to defend the nation, the law, and the king. They did as they were asked, though they were not too enthusiastic about it. After having spent the last several hours fretting about what scenes of chaos and carnage awaited in Versailles, Lafayette was quite relieved to find that things were not nearly as bad as he'd feared. Again, most of the women who had marched there in the morning were still on the premises. He sent a few men ahead to learn what had transpired earlier that day. They returned with the messenger sent by the king, who informed Lafayette that Louis, quote, "regards your approach with pleasure and has just accepted your Declaration of Rights." End quote. Encouraged, Lafayette had his men continue their advance as far as the Salle de Menu Plaisir before ordering them to halt again. They encountered no resistance, save for a couple of odd pot shots fired at the vanguard, but no one was hit and they chose to shrug off this provocation. After briefly conferring with some of the deputies still at the National Assembly's meeting chamber, Lafayette determined that the only way to peacefully resolve this situation was to meet with the king personally. A highly tense moment ensued as Lafayette approached the palace gates, alone and unarmed. Behind him were his men, weary and sopping wet. Some were able to muster the energy to cheer on their valiant commander. Most were racked with anxiety. They did not want him to go, as they were convinced the second he was out of sight, he would be seized and cast into some dark medieval dungeon never to be heard from again. Staring him down on the opposite side of the gate were the Swiss guard, under direct orders to allow the Marquis to enter, but nonetheless mistrustful of his intentions. As he crossed the gate into the inner courtyard, one of the Swiss guards called out, quote, "Here comes Cromwell," end quote. This was an unmistakable reference to Oliver Cromwell, the English statesman who was the individual most singularly responsible for the execution of King Charles I 140 years prior. An unflattering comparison, to say the least, but one that for Lafayette impressed upon him the delicate nature of the situation. As he later recalled, one false move was all it would have taken for him to turn from a guardian to a usurper. To the guard's comment, Lafayette retorted, quote, "Cromwell would not have entered this place alone," end quote. Around midnight, Lafayette, exhausted and, according to one witness, covered in mud up to his shoulders, was admitted to the king's chambers, where he found Louis deep in conversation with, among others, the Comte de Provence, Jacques Necker, and the Comte d'Estaing, Lafayette's old comrade from the Revolutionary War, who had been appointed as commander of the royal bodyguard. Upon entering the king's presence, Lafayette melodramatically declared, quote, "Sire, I thought it better to come here, to die at your feet, than to die uselessly at the Place de Grève," end quote. A quick note that the Place de Grève he referred to here is the name for the public square in front of the Hôtel de Ville. It is now referred to alternatively as either the Place d'Hôtel de Ville or the Esplanade de la Libération. Anyway, after delivering this line that he almost certainly rehearsed over and over in his head during the march, Lafayette offered his further reassurances that he had no intention to do any harm to the king or his household, and all but admitted that he had no choice but to lead his men to Versailles. Louis then inquired as to what exactly it was the people demanded of him. He did not understand why the mob outside had not dispersed even after he had promised to take more active measures to relieve the food shortages in Paris. Lafayette restated the protesters' original two demands, guaranteeing bread for the people of Paris and the withdrawal of the Flanders Regiment, and informed him of their new one, for the king and his household to reside permanently in Paris. Louis readily acceded to the first two, as he had earlier that day, but when it came to this last demand, he deferred the matter until he could consult his family. It was quite late, and everyone was so thoroughly worn out by the day's tumultuous events that they all agreed to turn in for the night. That is, except for Lafayette, who would not allow himself to rest until he could be certain the situation was under control. He worked out arrangements for the immediate security of the palace and its grounds with d'Estaing. The National Guard would patrol and stand watch outside, while the royal bodyguard would protect the interior. Crucially, the Swiss Guard and most of the men of the bodyguard regiment would return to their barracks for the night. They were under the assumption that the worst of the disturbances had passed. Only the usual accompaniment of 61 men would be posted inside the palace for the night watch. The Parisian demonstrators, for the most part, had settled into improvised lodgings for the night, and things stayed quiet, save for a few sporadic disturbances. It was not until 5 in the morning, just before daybreak, that Lafayette believed it was safe for him to rest, telling one of his officers, quote, "Everything has been attended to. The peace will not be disturbed. I am overwhelmed with fatigue and I can barely stand. I am going to take a few hours' rest," end quote. He retired to the nearby residence of his in-laws, the Hôtel Noailles, and, still fully dressed, promptly collapsed onto a couch. And now, a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. His respite lasted less than an hour. Just after sunrise, a group of protesters awoke to find a side gate unlocked and unguarded. They called out to their compatriots, who, after having passed a miserable night in the rain, with inadequate accommodations, and having failed to force the king's compliance, were just as disgruntled as they'd been when they left Paris to begin with. As such, they did not hesitate to rush through the breach in the palace's defenses and up the stairs that led directly into the queen's apartments. The royal bodyguard were totally unprepared for this. As I mentioned toward the top of this show, the men of the royal bodyguard regiment were exclusively aristocrats with very little training. And now this morning, this relatively small handful of just 61 men found themselves up against an onrush of thousands of enraged Parisians. The first of them to encounter the swarm of protesters fired off a shot in panic, striking down one of them. The mob immediately overtook the hapless guard and killed him on the spot. This incident caused tempers to flare even hotter, and the mob pressed on through the corridors of the palace, searching for the queen. One witness reported hearing one of the women shouting that they would, quote, "tear out the heart of that hussy, cut off her head, fricassee her liver, and even then it won't be over," end quote. Despite the intruders' demonstrated propensity for violence, the rest of the royal bodyguard seemed to have been under the assumption that yesterday's order to not fire on civilians still stood. and so they had no choice but to retreat deeper into the recesses of the palace. Another bodyguard posted immediately outside the Queen's bedchamber was also cornered by the mob. He managed to call out a warning that the Queen's life was in danger before they set upon him and murdered him as well. This bought Marie Antoinette enough time to escape. Still dressed in her nightgown, she ran barefoot through a concealed passageway that led to the king's apartments on the opposite side of the building. Reaching the king's bedchamber, she found herself locked out. The sounds of commotion were getting louder and louder as Marie Antoinette pounded frantically on the door, calling out for her children. Before the mob could spot her, someone inside heard and allowed her inside. Any sense of relief the Queen felt at being reunited with her husband and children was fleeting. The mob continued to close in, and it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. A small handful of bodyguards prepared to hold the doors against the inevitable human onslaught, but they were desperately outnumbered. Lafayette was roused from his slumber by messengers bearing news of the disturbance at the palace. With no time to lose, he mounted the first horse he could find, and after rallying a company of National Guard to his side, he charged directly through the palace gates. In the courtyard, he encountered a small group of royal bodyguard fighting a desperate but losing melee against a much larger group of civilians. Not too far away, the severed heads of the 2 bodyguards killed earlier that day had been stuck on pikes and were being waved around, leaving little doubt as to what these men's fates were to be. One of these bodyguards later testified, quote, "Amid this cruel uncertainty, the Marquis de Lafayette arrived. He saved our lives." End quote. After rescuing these men from what was certain to be a grisly end, Lafayette took a small detachment with him into the palace in search of the royal family, leaving the bulk of his men to secure the entrances behind him. To his relief, a company of National Guard had already secured that wing of the palace. Lafayette found the royal family huddled together in a drawing room, badly shaken by the morning's events but physically unharmed. Apparently the National Guards who had entered the palace earlier were mostly former members of the French Guards regiment, and there was still enough mutual trust between them and the bodyguard that they were able to come to an understanding. They spent the next 2 hours working to eject the remaining protesters from the building, keeping them kettled in the inner courtyard but unable to push them further away. Lafayette conferred with the king, the queen, and the handful of ministers who were also present as to their next move. All the while, the clamoring from the protesters below only grew louder. They refused to leave until the king showed himself. Initially, Lafayette stepped onto the balcony, furiously haranguing the people for having violated the sanctity of the king's residence, for threatening the safety of his person and his family, or something to that effect. His words were inaudible over the multitude below who had begun chanting, quote, to Paris, end quote. It was now abundantly clear to Lafayette what had to be done to put an end to this madness. He returned to the king and queen and restated the people's demand. Both of them balked at the notion, and understandably so. The French monarchy had been based in Versailles since 1682, little over a century. For Louis, it was the only home he'd ever known. He was born there, and most likely thought that he would die there as well. Marie Antoinette was especially averse to the prospect of living in the midst of a population that she knew absolutely despised her. Lafayette urged the couple to reconsider, arguing that if they chose to remain in Versailles, he could no longer guarantee their safety. And with everything that had taken place over the last 2 days, it was abundantly clear to them that the Marquis was telling the truth. Finally, and reluctantly, Louis agreed. Lafayette ushered the king onto the balcony. After taking a moment to compose himself, Louis XVI addressed his subjects below. He told them that he had heard their demands and that he would relocate to Paris, entrusting himself and his family to, quote, the love of my good and faithful subjects, end quote. The disposition of the crowd changed almost instantaneously. Cheers of "Long live the king" could be heard below. The applause died down somewhat, and the king spoke again, claiming that the accusations made against his bodyguard were untrue and that they had been unfairly maligned. In an ingenious moment of political theater, Lafayette sent for a young, non-commissioned officer of the bodyguard, embraced him, and pinned a tricolor cockade to his hat, resulting in jubilant cries from a crowd of people who were dead set on disemboweling these men not even 2 hours prior. Still, the people were not totally mollified. They now called out for the Queen to make an appearance. Marie Antoinette was all too aware that she was the true object of the people's hatred. When Lafayette asked her what she intended to do, she offered the following reply, quote, I know the fate that awaits me. I am ready to die at the feet of my king and in the arms of my children, end quote. Lafayette would not accept this. He asked her to come onto the balcony with him. Marie Antoinette was slightly incredulous, responding, quote, alone? Onto the balcony? Have you not heard the things that they are saying about me? Have you not seen the gestures they've made towards me? End quote. Lafayette insisted, quote, yes, madame, I have heard and I have seen. Come with me. End quote. Lafayette attempted to once more address the people, but could scarcely make himself heard above the din of obscenities and threats from below. So, he made a split-second decision to make an unspoken gesture as powerful as any words could have been. He bowed before the Queen, took her hand in his, and kissed it. This was an incredibly risky gesture. As Chalma describes, quote, "The effect may have been catastrophic, ridiculous even, proving that the Marquis was nothing more than a court lackey pretending to be a patriot, but it worked a miracle." End quote. The crowd fell silent for a moment. Then they cheered, exclaiming something that had not been heard in public for over a decade: "Long live the Queen." The next order of business for Lafayette was to help organize the relocation of the royal household and the government to Paris, and to ensure that the thousands of civilian protesters and his National Guard made it back to the city in a safe and semi-orderly manner. Each of these tasks individually would have been a monumental undertaking. Somehow, all the arrangements were made in just a few hours. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, an immense cortege, 60,000 people by some estimates, set off from Versailles. The procession was so massive that it took 9 hours for the last of it to reach the city. The citizens of Paris were encouraged by Lafayette to lead the way themselves, which they were more than happy to do. They were ecstatic, jubilant even. They'd accomplished what they'd set out to do, and now were returning home in triumph. Some attached loaves of bread to the ends of bayonets and pikes, raising them high in the air as trophies as they marched. Some of the women rode along, straddling cannons, and gleefully sang that they were bringing the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's lad to the city. Unmistakable references to the king, the queen, and the Dauphin. Chalma relates the lyrics of one of these songs, sung by the Poissards, the fishwives, commemorating their hard-won victory. Quote, "To Versailles, like bragging lads, we brought with us all our guns. We had to show that though we were but women, a courage that no one could reproach us for. Now we won't have to go far when we want to see our king. We love him with a love without equal, since he's come to live with us in our capital." End quote. I'm sure it sounds a lot more poetic in the original French. Following behind the commoners were half of the National Guard, acting as a buffer between them and the carriage containing the royal family, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and their 2 children. Alongside rode the hero of the hour, the Marquis de Lafayette. According to eyewitnesses, he appeared somewhat somber and spoke very little during the journey. Next came the rest of the National Guard, and the carriages transporting the ministers of government, including Necker, and deputies of the National Assembly. Not nearly all of them, mind you, just 100 by most accounts. For context, exact numbers are difficult to determine, but there were at least 1,000 deputies in the assembly at any given time. The rest of them were given 2 weeks to relocate. Not all of them did, as some 50 of the most conservative among them refused to go to Paris and resigned in protest. Most of them subsequently fled the country, including the former president, Jean-Joseph Mounier. Following behind them came what seemed like an endless cavalcade of the king's relatives, courtiers, functionaries, servants, and others, effectively half the population of Versailles. They brought along with them dozens of wagons laden with sacks of flour from the palace storehouses, a benevolent gift from the king to his subjects. Behind them, Versailles, the nerve center of the kingdom, the nation's crown jewel, the zenith of absolutist splendor, became a ghost town practically overnight. Lafayette ordered a few guards to stay behind and protect the area from looters. The palace of the Sun King was left derelict. Its windows and doors were boarded up, and a massive padlock was placed on the main gate. Inside, laborers began covering up the furniture and preparing it for transport to the monarch's new residence. For the royal family, the 6-hour journey to Paris must have been nerve-wracking. They had to have understood, the children perhaps accepted, that the monarch's relationship with his subjects had been irrevocably changed. Meanwhile, Lafayette sent a messenger ahead to notify Mayor Bailly and the commune of the cavalcade's imminent arrival. It was nearly dusk when the royal family reached the city gates. They were welcomed there by a deputation of municipal officials headed by the mayor. Bailly thanked the king for bringing flour to relieve the famine. Louis managed to force out a few words, expressing his, quote, "pleasure and confidence to be among the citizens of the good city of Paris," end quote. Bailly then joined the procession as it made its way to the Hôtel de Ville, where the king and queen were expected to make a brief public appearance that evening. Once all these formalities were done with, Lafayette then helped escort the royal family into the building that would be their home for the foreseeable future, the Tuileries Palace. Built in the 16th century, the Tuileries sat on the right bank of the Seine. Its immense facade, nearly 1,000 feet across, sat adjacent to the Louvre, which was not yet a museum. The Tuileries had been the primary residence of the French monarch prior to the construction of Versailles, and though it remained the monarch's official residence in Paris, Louis XVI and his immediate predecessors had rarely availed themselves of it over the last century. Compared to Versailles, the Tuileries was not quite as expansive and not nearly as opulent. Author W.E. Woodward describes the challenges of renovating the palace into an acceptable state for the royal family on such short notice. Quote, "On the morning of October 6th, a galloping messenger was sent to Paris to notify the authorities that the royal family was coming, and that the Tuileries must be prepared for their reception. It was a Herculean task. No king of France had lived there for more than 100 years. Its hundreds of rooms were occupied by officers who lived on pensions, nice old ladies, retired officials, and penniless nobles. None paid any rent. It was a vast nest of respectable nobodies. When the messenger arrived, all these tenants were thrown out pell-mell before nightfall. Puzzled architects wandered through the wilderness of rooms and wondered what ought to be done to make them habitable. There should be reception halls, spacious drawing rooms, dining rooms, apartments for the king and queen. Besides, 2,000 servants were coming eventually, as soon as adequate lodgings could be made for them. That first night, the royal family slept on cots in 2 adjoining rooms. Several months passed before the Tuileries was transformed into a royal palace, and even after the repairs and renovations were finished, the great building possessed none of the splendor of Versailles. It resembled more than anything else one huge barrack." End quote. Needless to say, the royal family were none too pleased with their new living arrangements. Louis would, 2 years later, give voice to his displeasure with the state of the palace upon his arrival. Referring to himself in the third person, quote, "Nothing had been prepared to receive the king. Moreover, the disposition of the apartments did not afford the comforts to which His Majesty had been accustomed in the other royal properties, and which every individual of means is able to enjoy." End quote. In that exact moment, however, the king was probably just relieved that he and his family were still alive. While Lafayette was seeing to it that the royal family got settled into their new home that evening, he encountered Louis's aunt, Madame Adelaide. She pulled him aside and thanked him profusely for his actions, saying, quote, "I owe you more than my own life, monsieur. I owe you the life of my poor nephew, the king." End quote. The princess was not the only one singing Lafayette's praises at the end of the day. William Short, the de facto U.S. ambassador to France since Jefferson's departure a month prior, reported that, quote, "His success in saving the royal family has acquired from him all parties the appellation of guardian angel of the day." End quote. Indeed, the fact that the march on Versailles had not ended in a total catastrophe was nothing short of a miracle, and it was thanks in large part to Lafayette that there had been minimal destruction and bloodshed. Although he had been forced to lead the march on Versailles by coercion, he somehow managed to regain control over the situation, emerging not only unscathed, but with his fame having risen to new heights. He gave his own assessment of these events in a letter he wrote to the Madame de Sémillon. Quote, "Things turned out better than anyone dared hope. The solidarity of the troops prevented what I feared from happening. Our army took an oath of loyalty to the king, in spite of their scheming and plotting. The king and queen behaved very well." End quote. The events of October 5th and 6th, often referred to as the October Days, did more than merely enhance Lafayette's reputation. As of October 7th, he was more powerful, politically and militarily, than ever before. Louis appointed Lafayette as commander of all armed forces in the Ile-de-France region, effectively extending the area under his jurisdiction by a radius of approximately 45 miles, or 72 kilometers, out from the Paris city limits. This appointment was confirmed by the National Assembly a short time later. The 4 companies of the royal bodyguard were disbanded upon the move to Paris, meaning that the security of the king and his family were now the responsibility of Lafayette's National Guard. This meant that he now had the power to decide who was allowed a royal audience, and he himself had immediate access to the king's person whenever he felt the need arise. Even though things had worked out in his favor, Lafayette was still the slightest bit perturbed. He knew better than anyone else that this triumph had been involuntary, and that his situation was highly precarious. The events of the October Days are surrounded by myth. Even at the time, there was a great deal of uncertainty as to how the Women's March on Versailles had begun. Was it truly a spontaneous event, or had these events been deliberately orchestrated? In the immediate aftermath, many believed that the latter was the case, with the Duc d'Orléans as the primary suspect. The motive was clear enough. The Duke had been at odds with his cousin Louis for some time now. Orléans and the political factions surrounding him were strong proponents of a constitutional monarchy, with the tacit assumption that Orléans himself was uniquely qualified to act as said constitutional monarch. His efforts at subversion were already an open secret, and so it was not too unreasonable to suspect that he may have had a hand in directing events in the hopes of forcing the king's abdication. Madame Campan, the Queen's lady-in-waiting who I quoted from earlier this episode, alleged that, quote, "Many people averred that they recognized the Duc d'Orléans at 4:30 that morning at the top of the marble staircase, pointing the way to the Queen's bedchamber." End quote. Another widespread claim was that the Duke had his agents disguise themselves in women's clothing to goad the Poissards onto marching on Versailles. These more salacious accusations were almost certainly untrue. Lafayette opened an investigation into the matter, fully prepared to denounce Orléans if any definitive evidence of a conspiracy could be uncovered. The investigation was inconclusive, but still, the widespread accusations against the Duke did point to a certain truth. He was responsible for the March on Versailles, indirectly. Again, it was well known that Orléans had been facilitating the print and distribution of radical literature liable to incite the public to violence. Lafayette resolved to usher Orléans off the political stage, and he was not above instrumentalizing these rumors to do it. In the course of the next week, Lafayette had over 3 private meetings with the Duke, in the course of which he managed to convince him to take a long vacation to Great Britain. Initially, Orléans protested his innocence. Lafayette informed him of the investigation into him, telling him, quote, "If I were able to produce evidence against you, I should have already had you arrested, and I must tell you I am seeking such evidence everywhere." End quote. This appeared to have gotten the message across. The king and his agents were onto him, and the Duke was entirely unwilling to risk open confrontation. On October 14th, Orléans appeared before the National Assembly to request a passport, claiming the king had entrusted him with a very important diplomatic assignment. He departed for London the very next day. This was nothing more than a pretense, allowing him to save face. In reality, the Duc d'Orléans was being sent into exile, and just in case he misunderstood this, Lafayette asked that a former aide-de-camp of his, currently living in London, relay the following message to the Duke. Quote, "My lord, I am here at the request of the Marquis de Lafayette. It would be needless to enter into the detail of the circumstances that have separated you from him. Monsieur Lafayette thinks that it is neither advantageous for you nor for himself that you should return to France before the end of the Revolution, and that you can only appear there as his enemy. He is entitled to declare this frankly to you, and to tell you, my lord, that at the moment of your landing he will consider you as such, and that were you to arrive in Paris, his intention is to fight you the next morning, and to justify himself to the Assembly later that day." End quote. Lafayette's insistence on banishing the Duc d'Orléans was not simply because of the threat he posed to public order. The grudge was, to a degree, personal. Despite the lack of concrete evidence tying him to the chaos of the October days, Lafayette still held Orléans personally responsible for inciting the violence that very nearly led to his own death. Secondly, his purpose in this may have been also to demonstrate his loyalty to the king and queen. Woodward posits that even at this moment, the great majority of the French population still supported the continued existence of a monarchy, albeit one constrained by a constitution and accountable to the people. This had been the rationale behind relocating the king to Paris, after all. Upon following suit, the first order of business for the National Assembly was to change the king's official title to reflect this reality. For some time, the Assembly struggled to find a venue in the city that would accommodate the requisite number of people. Eventually, they were forced to settle on the Salle du Manège, an indoor equestrian facility adjacent to the Tuileries. Like their original meeting place, this building was far from ideal, but it would have to do. While renovations were still ongoing to remake this horse racing track into a more appropriate place for legislative deliberations, the Assembly voted on October 12th to change the title of the king from King of France to King of the French. At first glance, this may appear to be an insignificant change, but in truth, it had far-reaching implications. Implications we can get a better understanding of if we take a closer look at the text of both titles in full. The previous title was, quote, "By the grace of God, most Christian King of France and Navarre," end quote. This designated the king as the absolute ruler of hereditary lands who derived his power from God. By contrast, the new title, which in full was, quote, "By the grace of God and the constitutional law of the state, King of the French," end quote. This formulation makes it abundantly clear that His Majesty ruled not over the land, but of the people. More significantly, he derived his legitimacy not from the will of God, but from the people themselves and the laws devised by their representatives. The point I'm trying to make with this digression is that there was, at the end of 1789, still hope that the king would continue to comply with the revolution and, in time, embrace his new role, however reluctantly, as a constitutional monarch. No one hoped for this more ardently than Lafayette. His devotion to the king had never wavered, and now that he was directly responsible for his safety and that of his family, Lafayette's devotion had never been stronger. He assigned a permanent garrison to the perimeter of the Tuileries. Hundreds of National Guards stood watch outside the palace day and night. Lafayette assured the royal couple that this was a necessary measure for their safety, in the event of civil unrest. The unspoken truth was that these troops were there just as much to keep the people out as they were to keep the royal family in. For the time being at least, Louis's relationship with Lafayette remained outwardly cordial. Marie Antoinette, on the other hand, regarded his constant reaffirmations of undying fealty with suspicion. The Tuileries was their prison and Lafayette was their jailer. She is said to have remarked at the time, quote, "Monsieur Lafayette wishes to save us, but who will save us from Monsieur Lafayette? End quote. And that is where I will end things for today. In the aftermath of the March on Versailles, Lafayette's power and prestige were approaching their zenith. And now that the monarchy was now centered in Paris once more for the first time in over a century, the Marquis was in a unique position to influence the course of the revolution. But what direction would he take it in? Did he possess a clear vision of the revolution's end? And more importantly, did he have the willpower to do what was necessary to ensure that that end was realized? You'll have to tune in again in 2 weeks to hear what happens next. In the meantime, you can direct any and all questions, comments, and concerns to me via email, perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. You can also contact me on Twitter or Facebook. Links to both will be in the description of this episode. I also encourage you to check out the show's website. A link will be in the description as well. As always, I encourage you to leave a rating or review for the show on your podcast listening platform of choice, and to peruse my eBay page where I have a number of used books listed for sale. Anyway, until 2 weeks from now, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you once again for listening. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.
Citoyen pour le bien soutiendra. Ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Quand l'aristocrate protestera, le bon citoyen au débit rira, sans avoir à le troubler. Toujours le plus fort sera. Ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Le peuple